Time for business, and I'm pleased to announce Kate Moody is here. Good evening to you.
Hi, Mark.
Starting with the latest on the cyber attack on a major oil pipeline in the United States.
Yeah, the Colonial Pipeline has been virtually paralyzed since Friday when it was hit by a ransomware attack. The operator of the pipeline says it's beginning to take incremental steps towards returning to service. It described the situation as fluid and continuing to evolve, and says it has a goal of substantially restoring operational service by the end of this week. The pipeline carries 2.5 million barrels of oil every day from refineries in Texas to New Jersey. The FBI says a criminal group known as DarkSide is responsible for the attack. The group itself posted a statement describing itself as apolitical and says it regrets creating problems for society. Those hackers are thought to have links to Russia, although the White House says there is no evidence of state involvement. Well, we can speak now to Tom Kloza. He's the global head of energy analysis at the Oil Price Information Service. That's an IHS Markit company. Thanks for being with us on France 24. If the Colonial Pipeline is able to resume most of its operations by the end of the week, as mentioned in that statement, that's still a week-long interruption. What does that mean for oil supplies?
I think for supplies, it's not going to be a real big deal. A lot of it's going to depend on crowd behavior. And if people react to it the same way they reacted to perceived shortages of toilet paper, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and you have a supply crisis. Right now, I'd say it's going to be somewhere between an annoyance and an inconvenience, but the language is vague, significantly recovered. We're not sure what that means. If that means 50 or 60%, we're still going to have problems with supply along the East Coast. And the big thing is that this reminds everybody about how vulnerable some of the energy infrastructure can be.
So not necessarily heading for a major shortage. What about prices? Could this impact fuel prices for consumers?
A little bit. We're almost at $3 a gallon in the United States right now for gasoline, and sometimes people react to that very vociferously. I don't think it'll have a major impact on prices. I mean, that's going to have more to do with the price of crude oil. And actually, we saw crude oil wander a little bit today because there was a perception that maybe U.S. refiners might have to pull back a little bit because they wouldn't have the outlet to move the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel that they normally do.
Do we know why the Colonial Pipeline was targeted?
No, I don't try to put on the criminal mind, but I would say that of energy infrastructure in North America, it's one of the most significant assets that could be targeted. It is very profitable. It's not owned by major oil companies more than it's owned by international private equity. And if you look at it as collecting tolls, let's say, they're collecting millions of dollars every day. So it's probably about the ransom and less about trying to disrupt supplies to consumers.
Now, you referred earlier to this certain vulnerability of energy infrastructure in the U.S. and elsewhere that's been highlighted here. Do you think this could be a wake-up call?
Yeah, I think it is a wake-up call. I don't think this is a seminal event in terms of oil supply, oil prices, but I think it's a seminal event in terms of cybersecurity. And a lot of people wouldn't take it necessarily that seriously before. I'm not saying that Colonial didn't, but Colonial would be a target. And every utility, every large refinery, probably in the United States and on other continents, is going to have meetings and make sure that they're protected against something like this.
Now, this cyber attack aside, the oil industry is recovering from the worst of the pandemic, which saw oil demand basically evaporate for a few months. Where does the industry stand now?
Well, in the United States, we're still running at about 10% or more under the last normal year, which would be 2019. And jet fuel is down considerably from that. That's actually a good thing under the circumstances because the most compromised product would probably be jet fuel under the circumstances. Colonial supplies a number of large areas directly. So we're still trailing behind. Diesel is probably running about level with 2019. And there's this notion that there's going to be pent-up social driving or vacation driving, which is going to sponsor some scrambles for product during the summer. That probably has more to do with the lack of drivers of transport trucks to take oil or gasoline that last 100 miles from the terminals to the stations.
What about from a supplier's point of view, how about pumping, or what's going to happen to supplies?
Oh, well, we've got extra supply in our pockets. And one of the reasons why I don't think this is going to have a major impact on the northeastern U.S. and New York in particular, and why the futures market kind of reacted with a whimper as opposed to a bang today, is that there's plenty of foreign gasoline in the North Atlantic. And a lot of the suppliers are willing to send it to the United States. You know, people sometimes mistake retail and wholesale prices. The United States has among the highest wholesale prices in the world. We just don't have high taxes like other countries do. So it's perceived that we have cheap fuel overall.
Oil analyst Tom Closa, thanks so much for joining us on France 24 this evening.
Thank you.
We've just got time to check on the closing bell on Wall Street. The Dow Jones did hit another record high earlier in the session, but it was dragged down below the flat line, closing just in the red there. The S&P 500 down 1%. The tech sector lagging behind. The Nasdaq down over 2.5% at the close. A relatively flat close for the major European indices. Shares of BioNTech jumped 8.5% as the German drug maker announced a 7,000% increase in its first quarter revenue, over 2 billion euros. That on the strength of sales of its groundbreaking COVID-19 vaccine, which of course was developed with Pfizer, Mark.
Indeed, it would have been a very clever investor who saw that one coming, wouldn't it? Kate, thank you very much indeed. Kate Moody with All the Business. Great to see you. Fantastic story about that pipeline. It's a really fascinating tale, isn't it? That's it for this section of Live from Paris, but stay with us, more to come.